To preface this review, I don't really have much of an opinion on the Final Fantasy series, mainly just because I've only played a couple of them, and that was starting with Final Fantasy 13. And everyone that I have played since then, I've enjoyed. Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 15, and then Final Fantasy 7 Remake, which I never played the original. But now we get a PS5 remaster of a PSP game called Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, and now they attach Reunion onto it, and it is literally that. It is a PS5 remaster of a PSP game. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion is a prequel set 7 years before the events of Final Fantasy VII. You play as Zack, who apparently helms Cloud's sword, and you deal with many characters that are already introduced from Final Fantasy VII. Now, this review is probably going to sound negative, so I just want to say this ahead of time. I really enjoyed Crisis Core. I really enjoyed playing through it. I really enjoyed every aspect of Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. I do have a lot of complaints about it, though. The biggest draw for me for this game was the remastering of it. Honestly, this could pass as an entire remake for the PS5 from the PSP. I've seen YouTube videos in full quality of the PSP gameplay of this game and compared it with PS5's port, and honestly, this could seriously pass as just a complete remake, because this game, even though it is from the PSP era, this game looks fucking beautiful on PS5. Now, you're not going to be able to compare it to God of War Ragnarok. It's not going to hold up. But for its time and what they did for the remaster now, it looks phenomenal. And the frame rate is just booming in it. It works well. It flows. It smoothly transitions. There are loading times, but they're not really that long at all. I'd say not even 5 seconds each. And there aren't too many loading times either. I saw the gameplay for the PSP, and there were a shit ton more loading times and loading zones in the PSP port. Now, for me, the thing that drew me the most outside of the remastering itself was the gameplay. Not so much the gameplay on its own, it was more so in the boss fights. I loved the boss fights in this game. Just the timing, it's not really timed combat so much as it's kind of timed combat mixed with Dark Souls death kind of gameplay where you die a lot, especially in boss fights, but it's one of those things where it's a calculative, you have to figure out piece by piece how to take them down, and that is what I absolutely fucking loved the most about Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion's gameplay. The boss fights mixed with its gameplay, mixed with it's not really kid friendly in the sense of kids probably won't pick this up and enjoy their time playing this game. Adults will, especially adults that like Dark Souls. Because, like I said, you're going to die a shit ton because they only have 2 settings, normal and hard. I played on normal because I always do for the story at first. And even then, you're going to have a bit of a time with this game. This game clocks in at around the 8-hour mark on just normal for the story. And the story gets really good by the end of it. The second half of the story will really draw you in. But honestly, I'm a huge fan of slow burn stories. Prime example, one of my favorite TV shows is Justified, where it's built every season. You find the characters within the season, and then it just takes the entire season to build up to a culmination of events. And that's kind of the same with Crisis Core and its story, in the sense of it takes 4 or 5 missions to really get through into the story. You're introduced to a couple extra characters you're not familiar with. Unfortunately for me, it really did take up until halfway through the story to finally start feeling invested in the story itself. And that's unfortunate because the second half of this story is a really great story. I didn't really care so much at the very end where it really just went back to big bad, need to take down and save the day kind of thing. But I really appreciated the characters and the character development in this story as far as the new characters they introduced. Now, another gripe I had with the story was, like I said, this clocks in at about 8 hours, whereas Final Fantasy VII Remake is just 30% of the main Final Fantasy VII story. And even that main story clocks in at like 20 plus hours at the very least on the easiest difficulty, which I believe was normal. This only had about 8 hours, and honestly, they could have done so much more with the characters themselves. Even bring in already introduced characters such as, Aerith, Tifa, Cloud. They could have expanded on these characters more, and even more so on the new characters such as Zack. Now, I really liked what they did with Angio's character, but that's really the only new character you find so much about. And that's a good thing because Angio's character and character development really worked well for the story and the combat involved around Angio. Now, the likes of Genesis, where it was just kind of bland stereotype, I'm monster, so I need to just be the big bad. I didn't really care for that part of the story either, but the Angio storyline really worked for me. The Zack storyline, it worked for me whenever we finally got into the main story, the main meat of it, at least. Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, they're always welcome delights, but like I said, I feel they could have done so much more justice and a lot more with the pre-existing characters as well as the new characters. That's just me, though. That's really all I have to say about the story. Now, the gameplay, as I said, it's kind of a mixed bag with the time combat as far as dying a lot. That's mainly just in the boss fights and mini bosses in the environments. And I do like that premise of the gameplay. Usually I don't like that gameplay style. To me, that's why they have a difficulty setting. That way you can do the easiest for the story, the hardest to achieve everything. Fortunately, it worked very well for the boss fights. Unfortunately, even the gameplay style of it really fucked with the boss fights as well. Now, there's a lot of balancing issues within the gameplay of the story, but the biggest sin that they have done for me is just the whole luck, hit or miss kind of draw for the spinning shit where, like a prime example, you're in a boss fight and you're beating them up, say you get them to half health, well, they do their summon, and even at 20% the ability skill or strength, if you don't have a great amount of health, you're dead. So if you're fighting at 2,000 to start for health, and their 20% ability strength for their summoning is 2,500, you're dead. Unless by some miraculous thing you actually guard it, which doesn't really happen at all in this game. Now, that mixes along the whole luck and hit or miss kind of thing because of the spinning, summoning kind of game style that they have for the combat. That's the only thing I didn't like about this game. I really liked the aspect and the premise of it. I didn't like how it was conceived and made in the sense of you're lucky to beat that boss. You didn't do it off of skill. You were lucky that you drew a summoning in that game right at the last minute. Because if you didn't draw that summoning, that ability strength that you just canceled would have killed you. That's one thing I absolutely fucking hated about the boss fights. Outside of that, I thought the boss fights were phenomenal. I really liked them. Honestly, it could have been perfect if they didn't have the hit or miss luck thing, and if they took that away and then not even just take the difficulty and the skill down on the boss fights, more so the hit power and just all of that. then I think it would probably be perfect boss fights. Now, outside of that, the regular environmental combat and gameplay, I like that too. The problem, just as much as the story, the first half of the game, it really feels like you're going through it like just in a breeze until you start getting harder enemies, which is fine. That's honestly how a game is supposed to be built. But the problem is you encounter harder enemies that overshadow normal enemies, thereby making the normal enemies feel easy as shit to beat. And then you get the boss fights, which honestly, some of those boss fights are actually kind of the same difficulty as the environmental mini bosses. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them. A couple bosses I went through in a breeze. Not all of them. But then you also had environmental mini bosses that kind of were actually harder than boss fights. Now, this game, as I stated as a remaster, it looks beautiful. I would definitely consider this as a regular PS5 game. It's nowhere near up to the PS5 standards that we're getting for new releases nowadays, but for a game that not only released in 2008, but released on the PlayStation Portable, remastered onto the PS5, this game looks phenomenal. I have no complaints in the visual or audio department. Now, this game has been heavily criticized, especially a remaster, for the dialogue not really holding up well. I didn't really hear a problem in the dialogue. That's just my personal opinion. But overall for me, I really enjoyed my time with Crisis Core. There are even so many more side events that you can do outside of the main story. So that's always a plus and a good thing. But there are so many things that bog this game down. Like Final Fantasy VII Remaster or Remake, I reviewed it years ago when it first released, and I loved it on PS4 Pro. I loved it. Crisis Core, I love it, but there are so many extra problems that you don't encounter in the regular Final Fantasy VII Remake. Overall for me, Final Fantasy VII back then was a 9.5. You can see my review why. Crisis Core, I'm going to have to give a solid 7 out of 10 because I still really enjoyed my time, although there are so many flaws in the story and the gameplay together. And it didn't really mesh very well for me to give it any higher than a 7 for a scoring. So, 7 out of 10, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion on PS5. Thank you. If you like this video, please feel free to join my membership plan on here. It will greatly help me in the future. Thank you.